Dust hung heavy in the dry Texas air as the sun beat down on the Sweetwater auction arena. The crowd buzzed with the energy of money, legacy, and prestige. This was no ordinary auction. Fortunes would change hands today. Reputations would be made or broken on the quality of bloodlines that stretched back generations. Hidden near the side gates, Jethro Kane stood still, a weathered figure in a faded hat and worn boots. Years had passed since he'd been center ring, since horses bowed to his calm voice and firm hands. Now he was a quiet worker behind the scenes, a shadow of a man who once commanded arenas like this. They used to whisper his name with reverence, the horse whisperer of West Texas. Now they barely noticed him at all. At the heart of the arena stood Thunder Ray, a magnificent muscled stallion with a coat that shimmered like polished mahogany. The crown jewel of the auction, his bloodline was legendary, his spirit untouched. The opening bid would start higher than most men's yearly salary. Jethro watched from a distance, something stirring in his chest he hadn't felt in decades. The auctioneer's voice crackled over the speakers, listing accomplishments and pedigrees that made the wealthy buyers lean forward in their seats. Thunder Ray stood perfectly still, not shifting nervously like the other horses. His eyes scanned the crowd with an intelligence that seemed almost unnatural, almost knowing. Jethro felt a chill run through him when those eyes found his. For a moment, the arena faded away. The noise, the heat, the crowd, all of it disappeared as something passed between man and beast. Recognition, impossible recognition. The stallion's ears pricked forward, his posture changing subtly. No one else would notice, but Jethro did. 22 years of burying his gift couldn't erase the knowledge of what a horse was thinking, and this horse was thinking about him. Camera flashes bounced off the stallion's coat as wealthy ranchers and oil barons prepared their bids. Thunder Ray was the kind of horse that appeared once in a generation, the kind that changed bloodlines forever. But as Jethro watched him from the shadows, he knew there was something more valuable than money or prestige at stake today. Thunder Ray wasn't just any horse. There was something in those eyes, something that stirred memories Jethro had fought hard to forget. Memories of rain and lightning, of screams in the night, of a loss so profound it had hollowed him out completely. As the bidding was about to begin, a man in spotless white pushed through the crowd toward the display area. Clifford Kennedy, cattle baron and certified egomaniac, approaching Thunder Ray with the swagger of someone used to owning whatever he desired. The look in his eyes spelled trouble, and Jethro felt his fingers tighten against the fence. Some storms arrive with warning, others appear in an instant, changing everything in their path. And at Sweetwater that day, the clouds were gathering fast. Behind Thunder Ray, smiling for the cameras like he owned the sun itself, was Clifford Kennedy, cattle baron, oil investor, certified egomaniac, dressed in a spotless white shirt and polished boots that had never seen real ranch work. Clifford was there not for the horse but for the show. He loved an audience. He loved power. And he hated anything that reminded him he couldn't control everything. The crowd parted for him without thinking, a sea of denim and leather, giving way to pressed linen and cologne. Cameras clicked as he approached the display area, reporters hanging on his every move. 3 oil fields discovered last year had doubled his already obscene fortune. Now he collected things, companies, politicians, and horses, especially horses that others wanted. Winona Hale, the facility manager, stood frozen by the fence. Her eyes darted to Jethro, then back to Clifford. She knew trouble when it wore expensive boots. With a swagger in his step, Clifford approached Thunder Ray. He ran appraising eyes over the stallion like he was checking the finish on a sports car. His mouth moved in commentary, meant for the small crowd of admirers that followed him everywhere. They laughed on cue, faces eager for approval. Before anyone could speak, Clifford slapped the horse's neck. not hard enough to injure, but loud enough to echo, a sharp cracking sound that cut through the arena like a whip. Conversations died. Laughter faltered. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Thunder Ray didn't rear. He didn't flinch. He simply turned his head and locked eyes with Clifford. There was no panic in his stare, only something deeper, more intelligent, more ancient. A quiet tension swept the arena. Alden Maris, standing near the buyers section, narrowed his eyes. He had seen that look before, once a long time ago, on another horse in another life. He looked over at Jethro, who hadn't moved. Clifford chuckled nervously and stepped back. The crowd began murmuring. Cameras clicked again, but the energy had shifted. Something invisible but undeniable had broken in the space between man and beast. Jethro couldn't look away as the dust began to settle. Thunder Ray lowered his head just slightly, but his eyes stayed fixed on Clifford. It wasn't the stare of a spooked animal. It was something colder, calculated. For a brief moment, Jethro felt his chest tighten. That horse, he knew that look. He had seen it before, decades ago, in another pair of eyes that burned just as bright in the middle of a thunderstorm, right before everything changed. Behind the rails, Winona took a cautious step forward. She had worked with horses her entire life and trained some of the most temperamental studs in Texas. But nothing in her years of experience could explain the control Thunder Ray showed in that moment. He was holding back. No neighing, no stomping, just a steady, eerie presence. It was like the horse was reading the man who had hit him and choosing to wait. Clifford, sensing the tension from the crowd, let out a loud laugh to break the silence. No one laughed with him. Instead, heads turned toward Jethro. People had forgotten he was even there. But now, the way his jaw had tightened, the way his weathered hands clenched at his sides, it was clear something was boiling beneath the surface. Thunder Ray wasn't just any horse. He was a quarter horse, pure-blooded, bred from a long line of working champions. A stallion like that didn't just win auctions. He carried legacy. His shoulders were broad, his stance regal, but it was his eyes that unsettled Jethro. There was something in them that didn't belong to a young horse. There was memory, depth, recognition, and it struck Jethro with the force of a freight train. This horse had that same fire, that same soul as his mare had all those years ago. Back then, Jethro Kane had been a name. He wasn't just known, he was respected. People traveled across states to watch him train quarter horses. He had a gift, they said. He understood the horses before they moved, and that mare, Cassid's Ember, had been his pride. Fiery, bold, impossible to break, until he did. They had bonded, truly. But one stormy night, something went wrong in the corral. A gate left open, a scream, a flash of lightning. Cassid didn't survive, and neither did the man he once was. Winona Hale had been there, younger then, just an assistant trainer at the time. She remembered the way Jethro had crumbled in the rain, soaked and silent, beside the body of his mare. No one blamed him, not truly, but he blamed himself. After the funeral, he vanished, gave up training, sold everything, moved out into the hills like a ghost. And yet seeing him now, staring down a stallion with haunted eyes, Winona felt that old wound bleeding again. There was history here, something full circle. Alden Maris leaned against the fence, arms crossed. He hadn't spoken to Jethro in years, not since their falling out over Cassid's death. But Alden knew bloodlines better than anyone. He had studied Thunder Ray's paperwork. The moment the horse was listed, there were gaps in the lineage, unspoken sections, private sales, unknown dams. It was rare and oddly convenient. His gut told him what no one else dared say. Thunder Ray could be Cassid's colt, hidden, protected, raised in silence, a secret born from pain. Inside the holding pen, Thunder Ray paced once, then stopped and stared toward Jethro again, calm, intense, almost expectant. The air grew heavier. The sound of the auctioneer's voice became distant background noise. Jethro's hands were trembling, though he didn't notice. For 22 years, he'd buried it all. The guilt, the loss, the past. But no amount of time could erase what was in front of him now. Because some legacies don't die. They just come back wearing different eyes. That night, the Sweetwater sky burned orange as the sun sank behind the hills, casting long shadows across the dirt paths behind the auction grounds. Most buyers had left, still buzzing about the incident with Thunder Ray and the slap heard round the arena. But Jethro hadn't moved. He stood alone by the old hitching post, staring out at the pens as if waiting for something or someone to come and confirm what his heart refused to admit out loud. Inside the stables, Winona Hale was checking Thunder Ray's stall for the third time. The horse hadn't eaten much. He was calm, but unusually alert, as if expecting something to happen. She ran a hand along his flank, feeling the strength in him, the heat. She pulled the file again from the tack room drawer. His lineage had too many blanks. Some private farm in western Oklahoma. No listed mares, no records of live foaling. Just a colt that appeared one day, registered late, and sold fast. Meanwhile, Alden Morris sat in his truck, parked just beyond the lights of the auction house. The papers he had kept, teas of Cassid's bloodline, pictures, old letters, even a DNA swab kit, sat in a manila folder on the passenger seat. He hadn't wanted to go down this road, not again, not after what happened between him and Jethro, but something about the horse, the way he moved, the way he locked eyes with that man, it rattled Alden to his core. If Thunder Ray was Cassid's, someone had gone to great lengths to cover it up. Back at the fence, Jethro finally turned away from the arena. He hadn't spoken to Clifford since the slap, but word was going around that the Millionaire might pull his offer. Not out of guilt. No, Clifford wasn't wired for remorse, but because Thunder Ray wasn't responding the way a prize horse should. Too cold, he said to someone, like he's calculating. Jethro made his way to the stable. As if pulled by an invisible thread, the night staff nodded, recognizing something in his face that told them not to interfere. He stopped at Thunder Ray's stall, keeping a careful distance at first. The stallion turned his head slowly, and for the first time, his eyes met Jethro's directly. The noise around the arena faded for Jethro in that instant. The heat, the murmurs, even Clifford's obnoxious voice in the distance. It all vanished. All he could hear was the slow pounding of his own heartbeat, and a sound from the past, a gate slamming shut, a scream, hooves on wet ground, a memory buried so deep he thought it would never surface again. Thunder Ray stepped forward in his stall, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring slightly, not with fear, with recognition. He moved deliberately until he was inches from where Jethro stood. A soft nickering sound broke the silence, and Jethro felt his knees weaken. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But those eyes, they held the same wild intelligence, the same fierce spirit he'd seen in only one other horse, a horse that had died protecting her unborn foal. Something had been triggered, and Jethro Kane, after 22 years of silence, felt the stirrings of a reckoning he never thought would come. Footsteps crunched on gravel behind Jethro. Winona approached, her face tight with concern, clutching a manila folder against her chest like it contained something dangerous. She handed Jethro a folded copy of Thunder Ray's registration form. Her fingers trembled. He hesitated, then took the paper. His eyes scanned the lines, his breath catching at the sight of a single name listed under sire, Whispering Ember, a stud created by Cassid's genes, long thought destroyed in a barn fire. The name on the paper hit Jethro like a blow to the chest. Whispering Ember. His breath hitched, his legs weakened slightly beneath him. That name should have been Ash, buried with the rest of his life 22 years ago. Cassid's only foal. The last piece of her was supposed to have died in that fire. But somehow, someone had taken that bloodline and brought it forward into Thunder Ray. Winona didn't speak. She just stood there, watching Jethro battle with ghosts that had never truly left. The last time she'd seen him like this was the night he lost Cassid. She remembered the flames licking at the old stable, the frantic screams, and Jethro calling her name through the smoke. Everyone believed the foal was inside, but now there was reason to question everything. There was no dam listed on the form, and the original breeder, he didn't exist. It was a ghost farm. The registration had passed through 3 different owners in its first year. The trail deliberately confused, the paperwork minimal, but just enough to satisfy regulations. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the barn, Alden Maris listened. He had followed quietly, unable to ignore the weight of what was unfolding. His own secrets tightened around his throat. Years ago, after the fire, he'd gone back alone and heard something moving in the ashes. A miracle, a foal coughing, burned but alive. He never told Jethro. He never could. They weren't speaking then, and part of him had been angry, maybe jealous, maybe selfish. So he gave the colt to a contact in Oklahoma with orders to hide the lineage. Now that lie stood tall in the form of Thunder Ray. Jethro gripped the registration form so tightly it crumpled between his fingers. His mind raced through impossible calculations. If Whispering Ember was real, if the colt had somehow survived that night, then Thunder Ray wasn't just any horse at an auction. He was blood. He was legacy. He was redemption. As Jethro walked slowly back toward the stables, he heard a soft whinny, deep and familiar. He paused at the stall, and Thunder Ray stepped forward close to the gate, watching him again with those deep, knowing eyes, not wild, not curious, connected. Jethro reached out, hand trembling, barely brushing the edge of the horse's muzzle. The contact was electric, memory and recognition colliding in one silent touch. And in that moment, Jethro Kane realized he wasn't looking at a stranger. He was looking at a second chance. Behind him, Alden Maris stepped back into the shadows, a man with a confession 22 years overdue. The next morning, the air was thick with humidity. The clouds rolled low over Sweetwater, promising a storm, the kind that felt more like an omen than weather. Jethro Kane hadn't slept. He sat outside the barn with a tin mug of black coffee, watching Thunder Ray through the slats. The horse hadn't taken his eyes off Jethro since dawn, and Jethro hadn't looked away either. It was no longer a question. This wasn't coincidence. It was blood. It was fate. The gate behind him creaked. Alden Maris approached slowly, like a man headed toward the gallows. He had a small envelope in his hand, yellowed and sealed. After the fire, he had gone back. The barn was still smoldering. He heard something in the wreckage, found the foal under a collapsed beam, burned but alive. Jethro's breath caught, but he didn't speak. Alden's voice broke as he continued. He had panicked. They weren't talking. Jethro was broken. He thought maybe it would be better if the foal disappeared, so he made that happen. Jethro's hands trembled around the mug. He stood, eyes locked on the man who had once been his closest friend. 22 years. For 22 years, he had believed they both died. He had watched Jethro drown in it. Alden nodded, admitting his wrong. But he had kept track of the foal, never sold him off cheap, never let him land in the wrong hands. He made sure he was raised right. He held out the envelope, vet records, DNA results. He was Cassid's. Inside the barn, Winona Hale watched the confrontation from afar. She had never seen Jethro like this, not even when he lost Cassid. This wasn't rage. It was something heavier, betrayal wrapped in relief. As the men stood in silence, Thunder Ray moved to the gate again, ears forward, calm and waiting. She walked over slowly, placing her hand on Jethro's arm. The horse wasn't just a memory, he was a second chance. Jethro stepped toward the stall and opened the gate. Thunder Ray didn't flinch. He walked out slowly, stopping beside him, lowering his head in what looked almost like a bow. Jethro ran his hand along the stallion's neck, his throat thick with emotion. He thought he had lost everything, but the foal was right here. He came back. And just as the first rumble of thunder cracked across the sky, Jethro Cain made a silent vow. This time, he wouldn't fail him. Above them, the storm clouds gathered, dark and heavy, a mirror to the ones that had swept through 22 years before. That night, rain had washed away hoofprints, had doused flames, had hidden tears, but this storm felt different. It felt like closing a circle, like returning to a moment to make it right. Alden watched the man and horse together, the weight of decades lifting slightly from his shoulders. He had carried this secret. For so long, it had become part of him. He had convinced himself he was protecting the foal, but maybe he had just been a coward. Maybe they all had been. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and clean on the dry Texas dust. By midday, word had spread. Whispers turned into full conversations, and soon everyone at the auction grounds knew the story, or at least a version of it, that the prize stallion Thunder Ray wasn't just any horse, that there was a connection between him and Jethro Cain, the man most had forgotten until yesterday. And that connection was deeper than bloodlines or paperwork. It was personal, emotional, and now potentially dangerous. Clifford Kennedy wasn't the kind of man who liked losing control, especially in public. He had planned to make Thunder Ray the centerpiece of his ranch's image, a trophy to flaunt at rodeos and high-end breeding circles. But after the slap incident, things had shifted. Buyers pulled back, offers dropped. His name was being whispered with a tone that bordered on mockery. That to him was unacceptable. He paced inside the auction office, fuming. That old man was poisoning the air around his investment. Outside, Jethro was brushing Thunder Ray near the stables, quiet and steady. The stallion leaned into him gently, no longer guarded. The bond was growing hour by hour. For Jethro, it wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about protection. He had failed once. He wouldn't again. Not with this horse. Not with Cassid's legacy. Winona Hale approached with concern in her eyes. Clifford was looking for a legal route. If Thunder Ray was registered under his name, and if Alden never updated the ownership, this could get ugly. Jethro nodded slowly, jaw tight. Let him try. That horse wasn't just a number in a system. He was blood, his and hers. Inside his truck, Alden Maris was already on the phone. The contact in Oklahoma, the one who helped him hide the colt all those years ago, had vanished 2 years earlier. Records were missing, but he still had the original swab from Cassid. And now he had one from Thunder Ray. He would send them to the lab himself. There had to be something conclusive, something undeniable, because without it, Clifford might just win with lawyers instead of whips. And if Clifford Kennedy reclaimed that horse, Jethro wouldn't survive losing him a second time. As the afternoon sun beat down on the dusty grounds, Jethro led Thunder Ray to the small training pen. The horse moved beside him, not like property being guided, but like a partner walking in step. Those who had worked with horses all their lives stopped to watch. There was something in the way they communicated, subtle, silent, a language built from shared blood and renewed trust. Alden returned with the DNA collection kit, a quick swab inside Thunder Ray's cheek, a small vial labeled and sealed. His hands still shook slightly, the weight of his deception not fully lifted. But this was a start. This was the truth finally coming to light. The lab promised results in 72 hours. 3 days. 3 days in which anything could happen. 3 days during which Clifford Kennedy's lawyers would be working to reclaim what money had already purchased on paper. But papers couldn't explain the way Thunder Ray rested his head against Jethro's shoulder As the sun began to set, they couldn't account for the recognition in those eyes, the connection that seemed to bypass words or training. Some things ran deeper than documents. Some things were written in blood and bone and memory. 3 days later, the air at the auction grounds felt colder, heavier. The storm had passed, but a different kind of tension lingered. Jethro Cain sat at the edge of the pasture with Thunder Ray beside him, the stallion standing calmly, occasionally nudging Jethro's shoulder as if sensing his unease. In Jethro's hand was a sealed envelope, the lab results. Inside was the truth. All he had to do was open it. But before he could, a black SUV pulled up fast and hard near the office. The door swung open, and Clifford Kennedy stepped out, flanked by 2 men in blazers, not ranch hands, lawyers. He walked with the arrogance of a man who believed everything had a price tag, including blood. In his hand, papers. He was here to claim what was legally his. Inside the barn, Winona Hale rushed toward Jethro. Clifford had filed for possession. He was claiming the horse through the auction registration. He was saying Jethro was interfering with his property. Jethro stood slowly, eyes narrowed. Let him say it to his face. As he walked toward the barn entrance, Thunder Ray followed. Not forced, not guided. Voluntarily, like he understood what was happening, like he was choosing. They met in the center of the open yard. Clifford with papers in hand, Jethro silent and steady. A small crowd began to gather. Other ranchers, auctioneers, hands who'd seen the story unfold over the week. Clifford, with a mocking smile, said Jethro had his fun. Now it was time to give the horse back. Jethro reached into his jacket and held up the envelope. Not yet. First they would open this. Alden Maris stepped out from the barn, holding a clipboard. DNA match. Cassid's ember was Thunder Ray's dam, which made him Jethro Cain's legacy. Clifford's smile faded, but he pushed forward. It didn't matter. The paperwork was his. The registration was his. Jethro stared at him, unmoved. And the horse? Was he his too? Thunder Ray took a step forward and pressed his head gently into Jethro's shoulder. In front of everyone, the silence that followed was louder than Clifford's threats, because in that moment, no legal document could argue what every soul there had just witnessed. The horse had chosen. Clifford's lawyers exchanged glances. Suddenly uncertain, one of them flipped through his papers quickly, as if searching for a clause that covered a horse's right to decide. There wasn't one. No precedent existed for this moment, this silent, powerful declaration that some bonds ran deeper than purchase receipts. The crowd had grown larger now. Cell phones recorded what was happening. Winona stood with her hand pressed against her mouth, eyes wet. Alden's shoulders released tension he'd been holding for decades. Clifford's face darkened to a dangerous shade. His empty hand balled into a fist at his side. For a moment, it looked like he might lash out again. At the horse, at Jethro, at the universe that dared defy his wealth. But even he couldn't ignore what had happened. Even he could see that some things couldn't be bought. He took a step back, jaw working silently. His lawyers followed his lead, closing folders, tucking papers away. No words were needed. The case was closed before it had truly begun. As they retreated toward the black SUV, the tension broke. Someone began to clap. Others joined. Not a celebration of victory, but an acknowledgement of something deeper, the righting of an old wrong, the healing of an ancient wound. Thunder Ray remained pressed against Jethro, 2 hearts beating as one beneath the Texas sun. The next morning, the auction office was quiet, too quiet. Clifford Kennedy hadn't returned. His lawyers had left in silence the night before, their threats ringing hollow in the face of what everyone had witnessed. No one could ignore it now, not even the auction board. The stallion had made his choice, and the DNA only sealed what was already written in dust and bloodlines. Thunder Ray wasn't a commodity. He was history coming full circle. Jethro Cain stood at the edge of the pasture, watching Thunder Ray graze in the soft light of dawn. His heart was calmer, but not entirely at peace. There was still the matter of forgiveness, not just of Alden, but of himself. For years he had carried the weight of that night, believing he'd failed Cassid, failed her unborn foal, and failed as a man. But now that very same life stood before him, strong, proud, and whole. Maybe he hadn't lost everything. Maybe somehow a part of him had survived after all. Behind him, Alden Morris approached slowly, his steps heavy. He never came here to take Thunder Ray back. He just wanted to make sure he found Jethro. Jethro didn't turn at first. He let the silence stretch. Then he nodded once. Alden should have told him. Alden was wrong about everything. He thought he was protecting the foal, but maybe he was just protecting himself. Jethro finally turned. They both were. Inside the stables, Winona Hale was packing up paperwork, relieved but exhausted. She glanced toward the pasture, watching the two men talking, the horse grazing between them. It felt like closure, the kind that didn't come with court rulings or money, just time, pain, and truth. She smiled faintly. For the first time in years, Jethro wasn't just existing, he was alive again. That afternoon, the auction board issued a formal statement. Thunder Ray's registration would be updated to reflect his true lineage. All prior claims were rescinded. Clifford Kennedy, despite his wealth and influence, was officially out of the picture. He'd underestimated not just the horse, but the bond between man and memory. Word spread quickly beyond Sweetwater. Horse people talked. The story of the stallion who chose his rightful owner over a millionaire became something of a legend in barns and stables across 3 counties. Some dismissed it as sentimentality. Others recognized something profound in the tale, a reminder that beneath paperwork and profits, horses knew, they remembered, they chose. For Jethro, the victory was bittersweet. Each moment with Thunder Ray brought both joy and an ache that had no name. Every touch of the stallion's muzzle against his palm was also the ghost of Cassid's touch. Every proud toss of that mahogany head carried echoes of her spirit. The wound was healing, but the scar would always remain, transformed now into something precious rather than painful. As the sun began to sink behind the hills, Jethro stood alone, with Thunder Ray running a hand slowly along the stallion's neck. He didn't need to say anything. The silence between them held everything: sorrow, survival, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. And as the sky turned gold, Jethro Cain understood. Some stories don't end, they just begin again. Evening shadows stretched long across the auction grounds as Jethro sat on the weathered bench outside the stables. The familiar sounds of horses settling for the night created a rhythm he'd once lived by, before the fire, before the loss. He turned an old horseshoe in his hands, one he'd found in Thunder Ray's transport box, rusted, bent, but still recognizable as one he'd hammered himself for Cassid a lifetime ago. Alden approached, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee, the steam rising between them, like the years that couldn't be taken back. He handed one to Jethro and sat beside him, leaving enough space for the past that still haunted them both. For a long while, they just sat there, 2 men who had once been like brothers, now strangers connected by a secret, finally spoken aloud. Alden's voice, when it finally came, was rough with emotion. That night, after the fire, after Jethro had collapsed in grief, he had returned to the smoldering barn alone. He heard a sound, weak, desperate. Following it, he found the foal, barely alive, trapped beneath a beam that had somehow shielded him from the worst of the flames. He should have told Jethro then. He should have brought him back. Instead, fear and something darker, resentment perhaps, for how Cassid had always chosen Jethro, made him take the foal away, hide him, create a new story. Jethro's hands tightened around the cup, the heat burning against his palms. 22 years of believing he had failed completely, that everything of Kased was ash. 22 years of a hole in his chest that nothing could fill. That was what Alden's silence had cost him. Across the yard, Winona leaned against the fence, watching them. She had been there for both chapters of this story, the tragedy, and now this impossible reunion. She had watched Jethro fade from the vibrant, confident trainer into a shadow. She had seen the fire consume more than just a barn, and now she was witnessing something she never thought possible: resurrection. Jethro set down his cup and stood, walking toward Thunder Ray's stall. The stallion nickered softly as he approached, that same sound Kased used to make. Blood remembers, even when minds try to forget. He ran a hand over the horse's withers, feeling the strength there, the life that had continued despite everything. Alden had saved him. Whatever his reasons, whatever his flaws, he had saved this piece of Kased when Jethro couldn't. The weight began to shift inside him, not disappearing. It would never fully vanish, but transforming. The guilt that had been his constant companion for 22 years began to loosen its grip. He hadn't lost everything after all, and maybe, just maybe, that meant he hadn't failed completely. As night settled fully over Sweetwater, Jethro looked back at Alden, still sitting on the bench, shoulders bowed under the weight of his confession. There was a long road ahead before trust could be rebuilt, but forgiveness had to start somewhere, and perhaps it began with the recognition that they had both been broken by the same fire, in different ways. Thunder Ray pressed his muzzle into Jethro's palm, warm and alive. In that touch was yesterday, today, and whatever tomorrow might bring. In that touch was the beginning of healing. A week had passed since the storm, not the one in the sky, but the one that had shaken the soul of Sweetwater. And in that quiet aftermath, something had shifted. Jethro Kane, once just a forgotten name in the shadows of the arena, was now spoken with a tone of reverence again, not for what he had done in the past, but for the man he had become when it mattered most. Early that morning, with dew still clinging to the grass and mist rolling low over the hills, Jethro loaded Thunder Ray into an old trailer that hadn't been used in years. The rust creaked, the tires groaned, but the purpose was clear. He wasn't taking the horse to sell. He wasn't taking him to show. He was taking him home, to the land where Kased once ran free, to the same quiet place where a younger Jethro once believed everything could last forever. As he drove along the back roads, memories returned in fragments: the sound of hooves on wet dirt, Kased's mane whipping in the wind, her soft nicker when she leaned into his chest, and then the fire, the guilt, the years he'd spent trying not to feel anything at all. But now those memories didn't feel like wounds. They felt like chapters, part of a story that had paused and finally found its way back. When they arrived, Alden Maurice and Winona Hale were already there, waiting near the old pasture fence. The grass had grown wild over the years, but the land still remembered. Jethro opened the trailer, and Thunder Ray stepped out slowly, nostrils flaring, ears forward. He took a few cautious steps, then broke into a trot, fast, light, effortless, as if the land recognized him too, as if Kased's spirit was watching. Winona wiped her eyes discreetly. Alden placed a hand on Jethro's shoulder, but said nothing. There was nothing to say. This was more than closure. It was resurrection. The hills rose gentle and familiar around them, unchanged by the decades of human drama that had played out beneath them. The old oak tree still stood at the far end of the pasture, its branches wider now, offering more shade than they once had. Beneath it, Kased used to stand in summer, flicking flies with her tail. Now her son galloped across the same earth, carrying her spirit in every stride. Thunder Ray slowed and trotted back to Jethro, stopping just inches from his chest. Jethro placed his forehead against the stallion's and whispered, You found your way back. So did I. The land had waited for them both. Through summers and winters, through storm and drought, it had held the memory of what once was, and now what could be again. Alden and Winona stepped back, giving them space. This moment belonged to Jethro and Thunder Ray, to the man who had lost everything and the horse who had somehow found his way home despite impossible odds, to the unbroken circle that had finally closed. And in that field, beneath the rising sun and the ghosts of yesterday, Jethro Cain was no longer broken. He was whole, because love once truly given never dies. It just waits for the right moment to return. Spring came to Jethro's land with a riot of wildflowers pushing through soil once scorched by fire. The old barn had been rebuilt, smaller but stronger, standing as a testament to things remade rather than merely recovered. Thunder Ray moved through the morning mist like a creature born of both memory and miracle, his coat catching the first light of dawn, turning mahogany to liquid gold. Jethro sat on the porch of the small cabin, coffee warming his hands, watching as the stallion ran the perimeter of the pasture, a daily ritual that seemed less like exercise and more like a greeting to the land itself. Each morning, the same path. Each morning, the same pause at the far corner where Cassid's marker stood beneath the oak tree. In the months since their return, something had healed in both man and horse. The nightmares that once jerked Jethro from sleep came less frequently now. The wariness that had tightened Thunder Ray's muscles when strangers approached had softened into cautious curiosity. They were learning to trust the world again, together. Alden visited once a week, bringing supplies and sitting with Jethro on the porch. Their conversations, once strained with the weight of the past, had eased into something approaching their old friendship. Not the same, it could never be the same, but something new and honest. Winona came too, sometimes bringing students to watch Thunder Ray run, to learn from Jethro about the language horses spoke when humans were wise enough to listen. The story had spread far beyond Sweetwater. People drove miles to catch a glimpse of the stallion, who chose his bloodline over wealth, who recognized what was rightfully his. Most days Jethro turned them away, but sometimes, when he saw something in their eyes, not curiosity but understanding, he would let them stand at the fence and witness what he now knew to be true, that some connections transcend time, transcend death, transcend our human capacity to explain them. Thunder Ray slowed now, trotting toward the porch as he always did when he'd had his fill of solitary running. He stopped before Jethro, lowering his proud head until their foreheads touched in the greeting that had become sacred between them. In that moment of connection, Jethro could almost feel Cassid there too, completing the circle that had been broken for too long. The wound would always be part of their story. The fire, the separation, the years of silence. But wounds, when allowed to heal properly, become something else entirely. Not weakness but testimony to the strength it took to survive. Not endings, but the necessary beginnings of something truer than what came before. And as Thunder Ray lifted his head, eyes reflecting the man he had chosen, Jethro understood at last. They had both come home. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of extraordinary bonds between humans and horses. Your support helps us share these stories of redemption, connection, and second chances. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.